thank you so much for joining us today. And we're going to start right from the beginning. What was your name at birth?
David Henry Chase.
That was your name at birth?
At birth.
We understand there was a name that your family had before that.
Yeah, my family's, my father's side of the family. There's a stepfather situation. So my father's name was, at birth, I guess his birth was de Cesare, but he had changed it already, but long before I was born. I think it says in Wikipedia that my name is de Cesare. That's incorrect.
Okay, yeah, we wanted to correct that for you. And when were you born?
August 22nd, 1945.
Where?
Mount Vernon, New York.
Where'd you grow up?
We grew up in Mount Vernon, then we moved to Boonton, New Jersey, then Clifton, New Jersey, and then North Caldwell, New Jersey.
And your father's name?
Henry Chase.
Now, did he raise you, or?
Yeah, what do you mean, did he raise me?
No, what did he do? What was his?
What did he do?
Mm-hmm.
He at first he was a mechanical engineer, and then he quit that to be his own boss and start a hardware store.
And your mother's name?
Norma Chase.
Did she work?
She did.
What'd you do?
She was a proofreader for the telephone company. She proofread the phone book.
Did she enjoy that? Was that something that?
She didn't enjoy anything, so it fit right in.
Did you have any siblings?
No.
Talk a little bit about growing up. What were your hobbies?
Hobbies. I never could really consistently do a classic hobby. I tried stamps, and that didn't work out. I just like playing, you know, playing soldier, playing cowboy, playing with trucks. That's what I like best.
Did you do a lot of reading?
I did. Fair amount.
What kinds of things did you read?
The first thing I think I can remember really reading was my father. I was interested in the Greek gods for some reason. And my father took me, and my father and his business partner took myself and his sons to the library. And I checked out a book on Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology. That's what I remember first of all, you know, a kid book. I liked, you know, boy adventure stories, Johnny Tremaine, things like that. I can't remember, Powder Keg, I think was the name of it, some book I read about the Revolutionary War, some kid who was in the Revolutionary War. I liked that and scary stuff, horror stories. But I read a lot, I mean, to be honest, I read a lot of comics. I mean, I read the classics, but I read, they were comics, classics comics.
Were you a good student?
I was.
Is there any subject that you excelled at?
I excelled at. I don't think there was one. I mean, I was really bad in math. That's the only thing I remember. But I don't think I excelled at anything. I was good in English, you know.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I did not. I mean, the usual. I wanted to be a cowboy. I wanted to be a fireman. Then later on, I wanted to be a writer, like a novelist. I wanted to be a Formula One race car driver. It changed all the time.
Can you talk a little bit about your...
I wanted to be in the Navy. I wanted to have a dairy farm. I don't know.
Can you talk about a little about your family life growing up?
My family life? Well, I was an only child. So it was just the three of us, but in the center of a very large extended Italian-American family. A close family, although the extended family, although constantly riven by schisms and feuds. One branch not talking to another branch, or one aunt cutting another one off, and then other people, everybody like forming their own teams and not speaking. But despite all of that, it was very close, and there was a lot of family activities. In my house, I've been asked that question a lot of times, and I guess when 10 years ago, I would have said, and I still would say that in my house there was always a lot of tension, and yet I'd have to say, overall, I had a great childhood. It was terrific, really.
What made it great?
I was free. My mother worked, and my father worked, and my friends and I could just roam around. And at that time, there were still woods in New Jersey. There was a few trees left. And I remember spending a lot of times with my friends in the woods, just playing and playing and playing. And also, we lived in this apartment complex, which didn't have woods. But I was just out in the street all the time. And I had nothing but adventures. I had a lot of fun.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
I think a pretty strong work ethic I inherited from them. A lot of anger I inherited from them. Sense of a grudge I inherited from them. And maybe a sense of humor. Actually, I guess I would say imagination. My mother had a big imagination. It was all in the service. I mean, I said very facetiously when we first started, she didn't like anything, so therefore the telephone company fit right in. But that's really not true about her. She was certainly an eccentric, and she was really governed by fear quite a bit, and she was kind of hysterical all the time. But she had a large imagination that she was always creating scenarios, bad scenarios, that didn't necessarily come true. And she was always asking people, she was very nosy. And I think from her, I inherited a curiosity about people.
Was it right from the get-go?
I don't know. I mean, I don't remember that. Whether I've always been interested in people. And I think that came from her, because she was like that. Or maybe because I was interested in them. Because the only people, there was no other kids in the house. So I was looking at these two grown-ups, and maybe I was always trying to figure out what made them tick.
Do you remember the first time that you saw television?
The first time I saw it, I cannot remember the first time I saw it. But it was no doubt in my cousin Johnny and Miriam's house in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. And the thing I do remember is I saw my first Laurel and Hardy film at their house. And I can never remember, I always get it confused. There's a film they did called Sons of the Desert. It's not that one, but it is one in which they joined the Foreign Legion. And I just had never seen anything so funny in my entire life. I was just on the floor, like rolling around laughing. I was probably 5 or 6. We didn't get a television until later. I don't think we had a television until I was like 8.
What did you watch once you got it?
What did I watch? I watched Andy's Gang. I mean, at that time, right when it first came in, I watched $1 Million Movie. I watched Andy's Gang. I watched children's theater. I watched Howdy Doody. I watched. I remember watching detective shows. It was a detective show with Ralph Bellamy. I can't think of the name of it now, but I really liked it. It was scary. It was. I think it was probably only on for a season. And he wore a trench coat, and he walked out into the rain at the end. Western movies. I watched a lot of old westerns.
What high school did you go to?
I went to West Essex Regional High School.
Were you involved in theater or anything like that?
I was, my senior year I started getting involved in it. And so I had a very small part in the school play, which was Our Town. I was one of the heckling youths. And I also did props in that play. It was just started getting a dawning awareness that I was interested in theater at that time.
Do you know what sparked it?
No.
And where did you go to college?
I started college at Wake Forest College in North Carolina, and then I went to, transferred in my sophomore year and went to NYU. And then I got a BA from NYU, and then I went to Stanford for a master's degree for filmmaking.
At what point did you decide filmmaking would be the path that you chose?
When the Beatles and the Stones hit the United States, I began to see that regular people could make art. I mean, I always knew there was art. you go to the museum and you see it and you read great novels, in high school. But you never associate the people who do it, or at least I didn't, with being someone like maybe yourself. But when the Beatles and the Stones and the British invasion hit, I began to see that they were making art and that someone like me could do that, possibly. And I was crazy about rock and roll. If you want to say a hobby, I guess that had always been maybe my real hobby was music. And so that's what I wanted to be, was a rock and roll musician. But at the same time, this is like mid to late 60s. Because, I guess now I know, because of the work of people like Peter Bogdanovich and scholarship about American film was starting, and film schools were starting. And I got totally sucked in by cinema as a potential thing to do. It never would have occurred to me that I never, I always loved movies, and I loved television too at that time. But I did not realize that it was made by people, that there was an individual or a couple of individuals. Or actually it's 300 or so, in the entire crew. But I just thought they came from a factory, just like a Chevrolet did or a Ford. And sometime right around then, I began to realize that there were people responsible for movies. And so I had this two-track thing going. I wanted to be a rock and roll musician, but then I also got interested in film. And the short answer to your question is probably the film thing won out around 1967.
And what you say won out, what does that mean?
In other words, it won out over being a rock and roll musician.
In what sense did you say, this is where I definitely want to go?
I'm actually going to work. I was making fledgling attempts to be in a band, and not fledgling. We spent a lot of time. Unfortunately, we did more talking about it than anything else. But we did a lot of practicing, and right around 1967, I think I decided, you know what, this is not going to happen. And I really love filmmaking, and I think I actually will study filmmaking and try to do that as a job. But that kind of talk, that was unheard of in my family or in my neighborhood at that time. People didn't go do that stuff. For all they knew, it all came from a factory. And, so the idea that someone would actually want to be a filmmaker was sort of alien.
Were you up against something regarding that, or were they, once you told them that's what you wanted to do, they were okay with it? No, they were not okay with it. On the surface, they were not okay with it. My mother never liked it. She never wanted it for me. And in fact, I remember I was going to my cousin's wedding. I was about to leave for California with my wife. We were going to get married and go to California, but she was my girlfriend then. But I was at another cousin's wedding, and I was telling, my aunt and uncle said to me, well, what are you going to do? Because college was coming to an end. I said, I'm going to go to California. I want to be in the movie business. And my mother said, people like Frank Sinatra will eat you alive and spit you out. I had no intention of working for Frank Sinatra, or that I'd even meet Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra had nothing to do with it, nor did I relate to Frank Sinatra all that well, but that's where she went with it. So she was always opposed to it. And my father was opposed to it too. They would much rather I'd been something more legitimate, a lawyer, a teacher. See, they were the children of Italian immigrants, and what they wanted to do more than anything else was fit in. They did not want to stand out. So they wanted, and I'm using this term facetiously, a white man's job for me, right? Teacher, lawyer, a very, very well accepted member of the community. Respectability, that's what they wanted. Did they live to see your success?
Part of it. And at one point, I told my father I wanted to be an actor. And he said, well, that's fine. He said, you can be a clown in the circus, but you're going to finish college first. Then you can do whatever you want. And which is actually was a good thing to say, I think. It's not a bad policy.
And what did they think of your success? You said that they did see a bit of it.
They didn't really get it quite. My father was dying of cancer here in the hospital in New York, like in 1966, and No, 1976, what am I talking about? And at that time, I had just become a producer on the Rockford Files, and I was young for that. And I was told that he would brag to all the nurses and doctors at the hospital about me. But when talking to me, he was dismissive of it. And he had a hardware store, and friends of mine whose parents would go in there would tell me the same thing, that they would go into my father's hardware store to buy something, and he'd be levitating about, that I was making this cheap horror movie and how great it was. Not that how great it was, but he obviously was into it. But when talking to me about it, he never gave that up. He just couldn't. I don't think they could relate to it.
Well, going back to your college years, did you actually make student films, and were you involved in
I did.
production?
I did. The first thing I did was I took a course at the School of Visual Arts, a night course, while I was going to NYU, and we made a film there. And then I tried to make a film of my own. I got a Super 8 camera, and I tried to make a film, but I didn't know you needed a story to make a film, and you really don't. That's only one kind of film. But that was the kind of film I wanted to make, but I didn't realize you had to have a story before you started shooting. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I got some friends of mine and some costumes, and one was going to be a Civil War general, but I had no script. So we shot the title sequence and some shots of people going through the woods, and that was about it.
As you progressed through film school, did you actually do some more?
Yeah, in film school I did. I mean, that's where you actually kind of. I mean, then also I began to study film, so I began to realize where it all came from and how it all works, and that. But my interest in film initially, when I went to film school, was camera. I wanted to be a DP. I was not story oriented at that time. Even when I started Stanford, even when I finished Stanford, I wasn't story oriented. I had done maybe 4 or 5 shorts there, all of which were narrative films. They were all fictional films, and the Stanford Film Department was basically a documentary film department. So I was in a very small minority of people who made narrative films. Even though I had done that at school, my interest still was to be a director of cinematography.
In terms of the narrative films that you did do, was there, what kind of look were you trying to achieve? What was your sort of vision as a student, going out into the world? What was your vision for the films that you wanted to do?
That's the problem. I had no vision. I mean, I clearly had a vision, but I don't think I could enunciate it, and certainly I hadn't figured any of it out yet. One of the things I did know is I didn't want to go work for IBM and wear a suit and tie to work every day, which I have on. I didn't want that kind of life, typical suburban life, going to work in an office. I didn't want the life my parents had said, lawyer or teacher. I knew I didn't want that. And I knew that I loved going to the movies, but even at that point in time, at the age of probably 21, I don't think I completely understood how it was done or what it even meant. So I did not have a style. I didn't think about a style.
So what did you do after you graduated?
After I graduated from film school, I started looking for work. And we moved to Los Angeles. I graduated from Stanford Film School, and we moved to Los Angeles. And by this time, I was getting somewhat of a better idea. And a friend of mine and I had written a couple of screenplays. No, we'd written one together, and I'd written a couple by myself, but only for class assignments. But then he and I wrote the script together, and we sent it to agents and people like that. There was a connection at Stanford. One of our teachers who taught script writing, and all she taught, all we were taught was formatting, like interior, house, night, and that's all we were taught. We never really read screenplays or discussed how a screenplay related to a movie that you saw. Just didn't do it. Because they really weren't set up for that. They were, as I say, they were a documentary film school. So, but he and I wrote the script together, and he separately, but we all moved down to LA together to try to break into the business.
Who was this?
That friend of mine was a guy named Bill Siska, who was actually, I think he's a professor of film now at University of Utah.
So you moved to LA. What was your first success in terms of of getting a job?
We moved to Los Angeles, my wife and I, and she went to work supporting me completely while I pounded the pavement looking for work. And the first job I got was I worked for a softcore porn production company. And I was doing things like cataloging film, sort of this way, way low down assistant editor stuff, putting leader on things. I had also worked at a lab, at a film lab in Palo Alto while I was going to school for a while. So I had some knowledge about how all that worked. But I did graduate from Stanford with the knowledge of how a movie was made. I'd never seen it practically. I'd never seen it at work. So I came down to Los Angeles and I just went to all these little film production companies. I went to the big ones. You know, can't even get in there. You know, and then I went to like little places that made documentaries, historical films, commercials, whatever. Just knocked on doors, and I got no place really. Except I got a job with this company called Clover Films, working in these softcore porn movies, and then they actually shot one, and I became the first assistant. And I did absolutely nothing. It was so low budget, so funky, and the story was about a platoon in World War II when we shot it at this burned down apartment complex in near Malibu. So you know that the look was right. It did certainly look like like wartime Germany. It was like a modern contemporary apartment house that was burned down, and we had these old German trucks and stuff and uniforms, and they shot this. It was about some guys, a platoon of American soldiers who come across some prostitutes, luckily for them, in the middle of nowhere, and there's some jewels that they're trying to get. And that was the plot. It was written by a guy named John Hayes, written and directed by a guy named John Hayes, who had actually, he'd been an actor in New York. He'd been Officer Krupke in West Side Story. And he had written a screenplay that actually got shot called A Cold Wind in August, probably in 1960. I think that might have actually been nominated for an Academy Award. But this was very low down. This company was really low end stuff.
How long were you there?
I was there off and on for a year. You know, they'd fire me, and then they'd hire me, and then they wouldn't have anything, and they'd fire me, and I'd look for work again. And then they'd have a project, and I'd go back on with them, or they'd recommend me to somebody else. But it was really like, it was internship, essentially. It was really very low-level internship. But there was no word called internship at that time. Interns were doctors. They weren't film students.
Were there things that you learned, though, from even working on those productions that helped you later?
No, I didn't learn a great deal from those guys. Well, that's not exactly true. I got a job as a production manager, first assistant. And don't ask me why, because these were not union pictures. There was no really hours to keep track of. I don't even know what I did. On a softcore porn movie, which was shot in Wyoming, Jackson Hole. It was about these two lovers who meet at a ski lodge. She was a senator's daughter, and he's like the ski bum or something like that. And it was going to be a legit movie, but they were going to, and it was going to be the story of their love affair and how a guy named Bill Wall was going to make this. I don't know. He had like this sort of porno film company, but this was Bill was going to go make a legit movie. And I don't know if he'd written the script or what. But it was about them, and they were going to get married. But her parents didn't like him because he was lowborn, and she was the senator's daughter. And then so we shot the film, but they also shot some insert shots. They shot some genital penetration stuff in case it didn't work. They could cut that stuff in, and they could sell it to some porn houses. And I don't know what became of the film at all. But here's what I did learn. So we went up there, and Bill Wall was going to be the director. And we all went up on a chartered bus. But there was a script supervisor. The cameraman was a real cameraman. The actors, we all went up in this charter bus. And Bill Wall, I shouldn't have said his name, I suppose, but I think he's deceased. But he really didn't know anything about directing. And I remember seeing him. He would say cut. He would say action. They'd set the shot up. He would say action, and then he would like look at the script. He didn't look at what was going on. He looked at the script and he would mouth along with the dialogue to make sure they were getting it right. So they were saying everything was supposed. So he wasn't watching what they were doing. And finally, the actors were getting it. People were. It wasn't working. And I recall that, and everybody was pitching in ideas. And I remember that in the end, they were asking the bus driver what he thought. We'd finish a take, he'd say, cut. Everybody would turn and say, what do you think? And he'd say, well, you know, I think you should do it again. It seemed like they weren't talking fast enough. Okay, take two. So in a sense, the bus driver, I swear, directed that movie. So what did I learn from that is kind of obvious. Watch what they're doing in front of the camera and have a script and prepare.
So what was your first foray into television?
My first foray into television was in 1971, I believe. Actually around the same time I was doing this movie. And my friend and I, Siska, our teacher at Stanford, Janet Volker was her name, had a line to a TV producer named Roy Huggins. And Roy had done Maverick and Run for Your Life and some pretty big shows. And Roy had actually come to Stanford to speak. We had people who came up from Hollywood occasionally to speak. But not a great deal because, as I say, it was basically a documentary department. So the entertainment aspect of it wasn't really focused on at Stanford. But so anyway, she knew Roy. So when Bill Siska and I finished this script, she sent a copy to Roy. And we heard nothing about it. Nothing ever happened. And that was like in 1970. And then I moved, when film school was over, my wife and I moved down to Hollywood, as I said. I was scuffling around for about a year and a half, trying to find any kind of job possible. And then nothing was happening. And I was just, you know, I was considering giving it up. You know, I was just doing nothing all day. And
what would you have done if you had given it up?
I don't know. Maybe try to teach school. I can't conceive of it. I don't know what I would have done. And some of my classmates were having a little bit of success at that time in Hollywood. But I went down there with a great deal of enthusiasm, and you know, and the concrete heart of Hollywood finally, you know, wears it down. And then one day we were at home, my wife and I were at home, and we got a telegram, an actual one of those old-fashioned telegrams. And it said, call Roy Huggins at Universal, stop. Want to hire you to write script, stop. And it had the phone number, and I couldn't believe it. My wife and I started dancing around the room. And we were also broke. We were going broke. She was working really hard at this boring law firm, and we just didn't have anything. We had no furniture. We had nothing. I remember us dancing around singing, we're in the money, we're in the money. And then I went up and saw him, and he said that, yes, as a matter of fact, I was either going to go to work on one of two shows, a show he called Alias Smith and Jones. And I was excited because it was going to be a cowboy movie, a cowboy show. And he said, and as we were having lunch with him and Joe Swirling and his whole, you know, and here I was in the actual studio, I couldn't believe it, in the commissary. We were having lunch, he said, yeah, maybe we'll give you one of those to do. And we're also looking for a first assistant on that show. And I remember his producer going, well, Roy, patting his hand, Roy, maybe we don't want to talk about that yet, okay? Maybe that'll be later. And then they shifted me over to the Bold Ones Lawyers show. But before this, my wife reminds me about this all the time, what I really liked was gangster stories and things like that. And she said, well, what are you going to do if you get this job on Alias Smith and Jones? And you know, and I remember saying, I'll just get into my Western thing, whatever that means. But fortunately, I didn't have to do that. I went to work on. I would have preferred to work on Smith and Jones, actually, which was a ripoff of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So I did this lawyer show.
That's the Bold Ones.
Bold Ones. And then I
Did
took.
you write? Did you write episodes?
No. Roy supplied the story, and I was brought in. He told me the story, and then I guess I was given maybe I took notes, or I was given a beat sheet to go home, and I was sent home to write the teleplay. And they didn't say we need it. They didn't say when they needed it, and so I took it. I didn't turn it in for 3 months. I didn't know how long. You know, nobody said where is it, and then of course once I turned it in, I didn't get rehired. And so I was kicking around again, and I watched it on the air, and I saw my name. I saw my name in the credits, and I couldn't believe it. I had my name, but I was surprised. I was stunned to find he changed some of my dialogue. I could not believe it. I was outraged. I didn't really know very much, but I had to join the Writers Guild because of that. So then I was a guild member. And I didn't want to go back and work for him again anyway because he changed the dialogue. And I didn't think it was as good. So that's when I began to think, well, maybe you should be a writer. Because I'd gone from wanting to be a DP to wanting to be a director. And now I thought, well, maybe the key to this is to be a writer.
How did you pursue that?
I wrote a script. That took me 3 years. I wrote a script, and by 1974, I had a finished draft of this script. It took me so long because my resolve was draining. I wasn't getting anywhere, and so it's really I was a kid. I was young, and I sort of giving up the ghost. And the Writers Guild went on strike. And because I was a member of the Writers Guild, I had to go on picket duty, and I was very resentful of that. Because I said, what kind of union is this? They haven't got me any work. And I'm supposed to go picket for them? I guess because I pictured in my head that it was sort of like the plumbers union. That there'd be a hiring hall every morning, you'd go down there and it'd say, anybody can do funny dialogue? And you'd raise your hand and say, all right, Chase, you get in the truck, we got a job for you today. You know, that's, I guess, what I was picturing. Like the musicians union or but it isn't, of course, it isn't like that. So that never happened, and they never got me any work. So I was resentful about having to go on picket duty. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me because I actually got closer to the business than I'd ever been. I was on picket duty outside the famous DeMille Gate at Paramount, the big gate. Just being there was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. And one day, and I was standing picket duty with people like Larry Gelbart, Steve Allen. It was that day. The day with Steve Allen was like one of the best days of my life.
You actually spoke with him? Or?
Yeah, we were on the same picket team for our 4-hour shift. And what was so great about it was, Steve Allen was famous for doing this man on the street thing. He'd ask people, "What are you doing? Where'd you?" And he was doing that. So we were standing there, and you'd have Steve Allen. A guy would go by with a box, and Steve Allen would say, "I wonder what's in the box, sir. What's in the box?" And the guy would stop and talk to him, and they'd make jokes back and forth. So I was watching him do his act right in front of me on the street. That was a transformative experience, just being around there. And he also told me that Milton Berle had been his babysitter when he was a kid. Steve Allen's parents were actors or vaudevillians. Milton Berle was his babysitter. So I was part of this. I was hearing this lore. I couldn't believe it. But while I was there, I met a guy named Paul Playton, who was a little bit older than me, but was very successful. He had been a story editor on Mission Impossible. He'd been to UCLA, and he started out as a kid actor, and he'd worked in TV as a writer. He and I got along really well, and we had like a lot of fun just on picket duty, sort of goofing on it, and trying to dodge the harder parts of it. And I told him I had this script, and he said, "Well, you should send it to my agent." So I sent it to his agent when the strike was over, and his agent wanted to represent me called me up, and probably, I really think that his agent wanted to represent me because Paul, who was one of his sort of his star clients, an up-and-coming young guy, wanted it. So the agent said, "I'll represent you." He was a great guy, that agent, John Schallert. And I'd had a lot of trouble. I'd shown people the script, and I remember showing it to another guy in town. I remember sending it to a guy, an agent in town. It was a book of them. And I got the script back, and it said, "I only made it to page 31. I wish I knew what story you were trying to tell." And I was, crushed by this. By this time, I did understand the story had something to do with it. So, and I tried, and it was a story, but it wasn't for him. But John Schallert saw something in it, and so he took me on as a client. Well, when the strike was over, Paul Playden took over the back nine of a show called The Magician with Bill Bixby. And he brought me on as a staff writer. So every day I was driving onto the Paramount lot to work and going to production meetings and going onto the stage and watching as it was being shot and participating in story conferences with him, splitting scripts up with him. We were like 4 hours ahead of camera. The whole thing was a mess and it didn't get picked up. But so we would write until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, get some pages for the scenes they were going to shoot the next day. Those would be sent down to the set and they'd be shot. That's how it was. The show was failing, and that was a huge education. And then everything fell into place for me in my head as to how it worked.
And what did you do with that? I mean, did you continue to write? Because I know you did a film somewhere in there too, the Grave of the Vampire. Was that
Grave of the Vampire? That's right. That was before that. That was Clover Films. That was. Okay. John Hayes directed that, and completely rewrote me. And I don't remember where that fit in, but that was sort of during my knocking around phase. And I don't even think I went on the set of that thing. But I was starting to learn how it actually worked. I think I did visit the set once. So I wrote Grave of the Vampire, and then he completely rewrote that. And then I was invited to the screening, and I was aghast. It was really not what I'd written at all. But what I'm trying to say is that just being in Paramount day after day, I learned how directing works, producing works, writing works, acting. I didn't learn everything about it, but I finally got a picture of what it meant. And I felt really happy because, the old studio system was gone. But in television, it was like the old studio system. You were making a B movie every week, It was a factory. And so you'd walk around like the Paramount lot and there'd be extras, people dressed like Martians or pirates, and I was free to go visit like the big dump tank and all that stuff. And here I was, it was real Hollywood, and it was an invaluable experience. And so that lasted 10 weeks. It seems like a long time. And then Paul got a job. Based on that, I suppose, they were going to make a series of The Night Stalker, which had been these made-for-TV movies. And Dan Curtis had made those movies, but Dan Curtis was not going to be involved with the series. Darren McGavin was going to be the star, but Curtis was out. And so Paul got hired to be the producer by Universal, and he took me with him. So I moved from staff writer to story editor on that show. But then Paul was fired. He and Darren McGavin couldn't get along, and he was fired, and I remained. And so I wrote, I'd say I probably wrote 70% of that show, because I was just the kid, they gave me all that work to do, and it was me, and then there was another guy named Michael Kozel, who we wrote a lot together, and we had a lot of fun too. And he created Hill Street later on. Another guy named Rudy Borchert was a great writer, and we had a lot of fun, because there was nobody, because the producer who replaced Paul was a guy named Cy Shermack, who had been the producer of Ironside and a lot of Universal boilerplate series. But early on in his career, I think he had written 4D Man. So they thought, well, who can we get that understands the horror genre? So they picked Cy. But it really wasn't his métier or his forte. And he depended on me quite a bit to do the writing.
Now, did you come up with the stories too?
Yeah, we did. Mm-hmm. Not just me, but we all did that
as part of a team. I mean, but we didn't have story conferences, strangely enough. I don't. We'd pick out a monster and try to do a story about that monster. We did a Dracula, a werewolf, mummy. We went through the whole, the pantheon, and then had to start making them up. So we started making up things like, this feathered serpent monster from Mexico and other nonsensical things. But it was a gas. I had a great time.
Do you have a favorite episode or piece that you wrote for that?
I have two of them, actually. One was called, and this is going to startle you, The Zombie. And another one, I don't remember the name of it, was about a monster in a sleep lab. My wife had gone to a sleep lab at Stanford because she has trouble sleeping. So the whole idea of a sleep lab was very interesting to me. She stayed there overnight, I think, and they wire you up, and so that was my idea, to have a monster that came alive during someone's dream, and that turned out pretty well. What happened was that there was a lot of tension during the making of that series. Darren McGavin kind of went a little, as they say in Doctor Strangelove, went a little, funny. He became sort of megalomaniacal and wanted to run the whole show. And he was running his own writing operation out of his offices, him and his wife. So we were developing scripts with Cy Shermack and Michael Kozel and myself. And Darren was developing scripts. And there was actually almost fist fighting that went on. I forget your question, though. What was it?
Oh, or just what your favorite or memorable...
What my favorite was this thing about the monster that came from this guy's dreams. And that's what I was about to say, was that the whole thing was kind of going crazy. Darren and Cy Shermack didn't get along at all. They never spoke to each other. Cy didn't really write the material and didn't want to write the material. So I was this young kid who was his story editor, who he threw everything to. And it was good for me because it really allowed me to blossom. But what happened was Michael Kozel and myself and Verdi began to take that show in a sort of comedic direction, which it wasn't supposed to be. But the whole thing was so ludicrous because the behind-the-scenes situation was so ludicrous that it was hard to take it seriously. So we began to make it into sort of like, in a way, a sort of a pothead comedy. And it was canceled after 20 episodes. But I was sort of free to bring, I guess, my own sensibility to it. So instead of it being a straight-up searching for the monster show, it became it became kind of surreal and more comedic.
It's a bit of a cult classic, too.
Yeah, it is. I know.
Do people ever ask you about it?
Yeah, they do. They do. I had such a good time there. I mean, I think we shot it in 7 days. And I remember, and the studio hated it because it was very expensive. And they wanted to shoot it day for night. And I remember Paul Pladen saying, "It's called a Night Stalker. It's not called a day for Night Stalker. You can't shoot it at night. Vampires can't come out in the daytime." Well, who says? This is with the production guy. Who says? I mean, maybe they got a special dispensation from the devil or something. Who knows? You can't write that in? No. Vampires come out at night. It's, nowadays, of course, I guess with these, it's True Blood. They're all over the place. Somebody figured out that they have to be out in the daytime. But we'd have these ridiculous conversations about nonsensical subjects, but people taking it very seriously.
At what point did you join the Rockford Files?
1976.
And where were they in terms of
That was their third season.
Was it still as hot as it was when it first...
Yeah, that show was successful almost all the way through.
What made it so successful?
Well, A, James Garner, and B, it was really good. It was really well written. And I mean, I don't give myself credit for that. This was Stephen Cannell. Was a very talented man and had very high standards. And
he wrote something that was just really interesting. It was really, I mean, the whole, you know, it doesn't seem that big of a deal now, but Rockford was a private detective who didn't want to fight. He didn't want to get in fist fights. It was more realistic. It was a dose of realism into the private detective genre. I mean, why would a guy risk his life for $150 a day? It didn't make any sense. And so he and Roy had created it, but it was really Steve's baby, Roy Huggins. And so Rockford didn't want to get his teeth knocked out. And he didn't really particularly want to work. And it was actually realistic in terms of what a person might have been like who was a private detective in Hollywood.
In terms of your writing, were you starting to see sort of your style come out at that point?
I had seen it start to come out, actually, as I said, on The Night Stalker. Kind of a combination of horror and offbeat, I guess, humor. In a way, kind of stoned humor, a little bit. I guess I began to see it there. And I continued it. I mean, I learned a lot in the Rockford Files, and I continued to see it. It sort of grew when I was there. He taught me a lot.
He being?
Stephen, Jake Allen.
Yeah. He told a good story about you in the Hooker with a Heart of Gold episode.
What did he say?
No, you just said that was your idea, your way of solving a problem within the three writers. So.
The Hooker with a Heart of Gold was my way of solving.
Yeah, they were trying to. Juanita needed a story and refused to do another prostitution story.
I don't remember that. I remember making fun of the concept of Hooker with a Heart of Gold. Maybe that's what he was referring to.
And they took it to heart, yeah.
Maybe I said something like, "I've got something. How about this? Let's just really like rip the envelope to shreds. How about a hooker with a heart of gold?" Because I had contempt for it. So we did it. You know, because it's all execution. I mean, you know, you can do any story, and if it's done well or differently, it can be good. We had a lot of fun. I remember one time he went off to do something. He had 3 series on there, and so he left Juanita and I to our own devices to come up with a story. And the King Tut exhibit was going around. It was at the Museum of Modern Art at the L.A. County Museum. It was big news. The Boy King. It was all of the stuff from his tomb. So Juanita and I started talking, and we started doing a thing about. It was a straight up Rockford Files, but one of the heavies came to believe that he stole something, and he could only explain it. He didn't really believe it, but the idea went into his head that maybe he had messed with some ancient thing and he shouldn't have. So Juanita and I pursued this, and Steve Cannell never wanted to do stuff like that, like any kind of like horror stuff, and he also never wanted. See, he was very smart. He said he never wanted to have like a serial killer be Rockford's adversary. He said because that's nothing. The guy's a whack job. He's insane. That's not a worthy adversary. Rockford's adversary should be smart. They shouldn't be crazy. They should be cunning. They should know what they're doing. Those were his rules. And those are good rules. So anyway, we started to explain the story to him about the King Tut exhibit, and the guy goes there, and so I remember him saying, "Wait, whoa, you fucking guys, what are you handing me, the Mummy's Curse? Is that what we're talking about?" And we said, "Yeah." So we did, but we did it.
You said it was all in execution. How'd it come out?
It came out really well. I remember Steve wrote a bit of it. I think he had to write it. Maybe we came up with it for him to write. And I remember this, Robert Webber was the main heavy. I remember one of his lines of dialogue was at the end, he was saying, "I keep thinking about that little boy king. He's going to send me across the river in a rattan chair." This is like total, and it was such a great, or he's going to send me up to heaven in a rattan chair. And it was just a good Steve Cannell image, like he said rattan, like, so it's Egypt. So it's not going to be just a chair, it's going to be a rattan chair. It was all specifics. I mean, that's how I learned that, the specificity is everything. It turned out okay. And we also, one that I was very proud of on that show, we did one that was all exposition. no one ever said anything that wasn't part of the backstory. That was my idea, and the backstory had started in like 1702, and Rockford had to try to figure this out. It was about a stolen painting, and it was called Irving the Explainer because, you know, in screenwriting terminology, there's this guy named Irving the Explainer, or Morris the Explainer is the guy who comes in and explains everything at the end. I mean, a really good example of that is the psychiatrist at the end of Psycho, who explains about Norman Bates and why he's like this and his mother fixation. Many, many times in a crime story, they have this Irving the Explainer character. So we had 9 or 10 characters who were all Irving the Explainers, and they would start just talking, and they would go back to like 1702, and then he brought it up to like 1804, and then it was 1930, all these different people. And Rockford was getting like a migraine because of this, and he couldn't solve the case, and he had to hire a logic graduate student from UCLA who made all these charts on the wall and tried to follow this case. And it was purely stupid and silly, and it wasn't a typical Rockford Files, but the fact that they were open to that kind of stuff I thought was great, and it was just made it it was very enjoyable.
Did you have a chance to